In this video, I will show you how to do a transmission fluid and filter change in a very common transmission called a ZF 5HP. Now, the 5HPs were in a lot of vehicles. They were used in Jaguars. They were used mostly in BMW 5 and 7 series. They were also used in the first generation BMW X5s, and Range Rover used the 5HP coupled to a BMW 4.4 liter V8 in this L322 Range Rover. Now, the maintenance recommendation originally for these transmissions was fluid for life. Now, I certainly don't recommend that. I think most people now have realized that if you want to prolong the life of a transmission, you probably want to change the fluid about every 50,000 miles. And with this method, you really can't change all the fluid. When you drain it out with the filter and with removing the pan, you're probably going to get about 6 quarts out. Maybe 6 liters, and you want to have 7 liters on hand just to be on the safe side. That way you don't have to stop the job to go get more fluid. Now, what I like to do is I buy excess fluid, because what I'm going to do is shortly after the fluid and filter, I'm going to come back and do a simple drain and fill. Again, you can't replace all the fluid in these transmissions without a pump, but when you come back and do a second drain and fill, you actually replace more of the fluid. You're doing your transmission a service. So let's get started. Now, under the vehicle, we can quickly locate the drain plug and fill plug. The drain plug is toward the front of the gearbox, and I'll go ahead and flip this over to orient it a little bit better for you. So we're now on the passenger side of the vehicle, and the fill plug, which is also an 8mm Allen, is toward the back here on the passenger side. And as always, when doing a transmission with fluid replacement, you want to make sure you've loosened that fill plug first. That way we know we can get new fluid in there, but do not remove it. You've got about 1 liter of fluid backed up against that filler plug right now because the vehicle's not running. So just leave it in there snug, and we can go ahead and drain the fluid out of the pan using the drain plug. And while that's draining, we can look at some of the parts that we're going to need to get the job done for the 5HP 24 transmission that we're working on today. Now, this is a replacement filter. This one's made in Germany. It's a good quality filter. And the gasket, I prefer a paper gasket without any rubber or cork compound in it. And this is the fluid. And for the transmission we're working on today, we just want to make sure we have a specification of an LT71141, and this is a Febi Bilstein branded fluid. For tools, really don't need that much. So the 8mm Allen you're going to use for both the drain plug and the fill plug. And the 22 bolts that are holding the pan on, those are T27 Torx. You'll want an extension for that. And this is going to be kind of a bit of a hero today. This is a spray-on adhesive. It's going to really be useful for keeping the gasket in place while we raise the pan. Now, you guys may have pumps. Some of you guys probably have motorized pumps, manual pumps. If you don't, you can actually use empty bottles to transfer the fluid into the gearbox. In fact, that's how I'm going to demonstrate this today. Looks like we're still draining, but I just want to point out, now, of these 22 bolts, what we're going to do is we're going to remove 20 of them, and you'll notice on this vehicle toward the back, there's a bit of an obstruction. There's a rock guard, makes it tough to get an extension on there. So I've replaced 3 of the bolts with 10mm hex head bolts. You don't have to do that. And I won't make you sit through the removal of 20 bolts, but we're only going to remove 20. What we're going to do is we're going to leave 1 on each side of this pan. And the reason we're going to do that is this pan's got a fair amount of weight, and even after draining, this pan has quite a bit of fluid in it. And so you'll be very glad that you did this. Just leave 1 bolt on each side, and I'll just show you here. Now we've got everything removed except the 1 bolt on each side. To get those 2 remaining bolts off, we're going to keep a constant pressure on the pan while we loosen those bolts. Okay, and that's fairly important. You'll notice with one hand I'm keeping the pan against the transmission while I remove the first bolt. And now we can go to the other side, same thing, keeping the upward pressure on the pan. We're going to remove that second bolt. And once we get both the bolts off, you just want to keep that pan as level as possible and lower it. If you start tilting it, you may get some splash. It's not going to be good. Now, this thing's going to drip for a while. I never promised you this would be the neatest and tidiest thing that you're going to do today. But I've got a large pan capturing most of this and some absorbent mats that are picking up anything that goes beyond the pan. Now we can remove the filter. Now the filter is also a T27 Torx. And I want you to be aware that once you've loosened the bolts on the filter, it's also got a fair amount of fluid in it, and you're going to hear that dump out. When you do this job without removing the pan and the filter, you can do it with about 1 liter less fluid. So when you do a simple drain and fill. Now you can see we still have our O-ring on there. You want to check and make sure your O-ring came off with the old filter. And now the new filter, I put a little bit of fresh transmission fluid on the O-ring, and we can just simply hand tighten the bolts first. And once you get both the filter bolts in place, you can tighten those down to about 4 foot-pounds. You really don't want to over tighten these, just snug them down and they'll be fine. And clean up the gasket surface best you can. And also I found cleaning up the bolts was nice, so they cleaned up real well. And this is the fluid that was left in the pan. Fair amount of fluid in there. So between the filter and the pan, again, you've got about 1 liter of fluid that you're not going to need when you come back later and do the simple drain and fill. Now, these pans, depending on the model of transmission you have, they have magnets in the bottom, and they're going to be dirty, and that's normal. Unless you have fairly large metal fragments in there, I wouldn't worry too much about it. They're just doing their job, and you want to clean those up. And I also cleaned up the rest of the pan. As you can see here, everything's cleaned up, and the gasket surface, just going to use a little gasket cleaner on there, make sure everything's removed. Make sure you inspect that. You want it to be clean, you want it to be dry. And then we're ready to prepare the gasket. I've just put 2 coats of this stuff on. We put a quick coat on first, and I'll skip through some of this, save you guys a little bit of time. And then I put a second coat on as well. And before it sets up, and this stuff can set up pretty fast, but while it's still a little bit soft, I'm going to go ahead and lay the gasket onto the pan, and that's going to allow me to shift it around just a little bit and make sure that all of those 22 holes are perfectly aligned with the gasket before the spray seal sets up completely. Okay, let me give you a better look here so you can see that I've got all the holes matched up. Once you do that, go ahead and give it a good pressure all the way around, press it down, make sure that it stays in place. So we're back under the vehicle, and you can see the new filters in place, and you can see my disposable absorbent mats on the ground, and you've got the pan with the fresh new gasket ready to go on. And just like we removed it, we're going to keep an upward pressure on the pan while we start those 2 screws, 1 on each side, to hold it in place. And once you get those in place, you're going to put the remaining 20 screws on the pan in a cross pattern, starting from the middle where you put your first 2 screws, and work your way to each end. And the torque on these is really not much. It's about 7 foot-pounds. Just check the video description for all the torque settings. I'm not going to make you sit through all that. Once you get those on, we're ready to fill the transmission. So now we're going to remove the filler plug, and we're going to get our first liter set up to pump into the transmission. And what I do is I actually have 2 of these bottles, and once the first one was empty, I've got another one that's already pre-filled, ready to go, and I just quickly transfer that under the vehicle. It's easy to do. You get your next liter going, and just keep pumping in until you get a slow drip coming out of the filler plug. And once you see that slow drip, then you're ready to put the filler plug back on. And we're going to do that so we can start the vehicle. And with the vehicle running and holding the brake pedal down firmly, just run the transmission through the gears slowly to help absorb the fluid. And now you'll see when we pull the filler plug off, nothing's coming out. Again, you should be able to get another liter of fluid in there. My first bottle emptied out. I had to pull it out and start a second bottle. And just like the first time, once you get a slow drip coming out of the filler hole, we can put the filler plug back in. And you can tighten down the fill plug to the torque setting in the video description. You're almost done. Now you can just give a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for future videos. And to help out anybody else trying to do this, please do share this video. Thanks for watching.